Royal Guard SCREAMS. After Prince George drops to his feet begging, she forced me to do this. It was a quiet afternoon at Buckingham Palace, the kind of day that seemed calm and ordinary, yet it held the potential for something unexpected. Prince George, still young but with the responsibilities of a future king looming over him, was spending his day learning the art of royal duty. As the son of Prince William and Catherine, he was already used to the strict rules and expectations that came with being part of the royal family. Everything had its place, its time, and its purpose. This life, while filled with privilege, was also one of constant scrutiny. The palace halls echoed with the sound of polished shoes and soft murmurs as staff moved through the corridors, making sure everything was in its proper order. But amidst the mundane routine, a certain restlessness seemed to hang in the air. George had always been a bright child, full of curiosity, but there was something in him that longed for more than the confines of royal life. The endless duties, the constant attention, the formalities, it all felt so restricting at times. His thoughts were interrupted when Princess Alexandra, a cousin from the royal family, entered the room. Alexandra had always been different from the others in the royal family. She wasn't as concerned with the expectations of tradition, and she had a rebellious streak that often got her into trouble. Today, though, she wasn't wearing her usual confident smile. Instead, there was a look in her eyes, a spark that caught George's attention. "George, are you ready for something exciting?" Alexandra asked with a mischievous grin. George, who had been seated by the grand fireplace, looked up at her intrigued. "Exciting? What do you mean?" She leaned in closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "I've been thinking, we could sneak out of the palace tonight, go somewhere no one would expect us. We can escape all of this royal nonsense just for a little while. What do you say?" George blinked, taken aback. Escape. The thought of breaking free from the palace, even for a short time, felt both thrilling and terrifying. He had never thought about doing something so daring. But the idea of leaving behind the expectations of being a prince, even just for a few hours, was strangely appealing. "I don't know, Alexandra," George said hesitantly. "What if someone finds out?" "Who cares?" she scoffed. "It's just a little adventure. No one will know, and besides, you're a prince. You can do whatever you want." Her words were tempting. George's mind raced as he considered the idea. He knew the rules. He had been taught them from a young age: never stray from tradition, never act out of line, and always keep up the image of the perfect royal. But what if he didn't want to be perfect anymore? What if he wanted to feel like a normal teenager, free from the weight of the crown that would one day be his? Alexandra's offer seemed like the perfect chance to experience something outside the boundaries of his world. "Are you sure no one will find out?" George asked again, his curiosity piqued. Alexandra smiled, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of excitement and defiance. "Trust me, it will be just between us, and I'll make sure we get back before anyone notices." George hesitated. Deep down, he knew he had a duty to his family, to the people who looked up to the royal family for guidance and tradition. But there was a part of him that wanted to break free, just for a moment. After all, he was still a teenager, and teenagers had moments of rebellion, didn't they? It was almost a rite of passage. "What are we going to do?" George asked, his voice a little quieter now. "We'll take a walk around London, visit some places the royal family would never go. Just imagine, no guards, no cameras, no eyes on us. We'll be free." The idea was so foreign to George that it almost felt surreal. He had always been surrounded by security, by people watching his every move. To think that he could be out there in the real world, blending in with everyone else, it was both exhilarating and frightening. "Okay," George said, finally giving in. "I'll do it." Alexandra's face lit up with a smile of triumph. "Perfect. We'll leave tonight and no one will ever know. It'll be our little secret." That night, as the clock struck midnight, George and Alexandra slipped quietly from the palace. The guards, ever vigilant, were none the wiser. They had left under the cover of darkness, slipping through the palace gates and into the streets of London. For the first time in his life, George felt a rush of freedom that he had never experienced before. The cool night air was a welcome change from the stuffy palace halls, and the bustling city streets felt alive with energy. They wandered through the city, laughing and talking, their footsteps echoing in the quiet streets. They passed by cafes that stayed open late, small shops that were still open for business, and even street performers who were making their living under the glow of streetlights. To George, it all felt so normal. He was just another teenager out with his cousin, enjoying the night. It was a feeling he never thought he'd experience. But as the night wore on, a nagging sense of unease began to creep into George's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. What if they were caught? What if the press found out? The last thing he wanted was to cause a scandal, to disappoint his family, or worse, to let down the people who looked up to the royal family as a symbol of tradition and stability. "Alexandra, maybe we should head back," George said after a while, his voice uncertain. Alexandra shot him a look of disbelief. "What? You're getting cold feet. Come on, we're fine. Let's just enjoy the night. This is exactly what you've been wanting, remember." George hesitated, the weight of his responsibilities pulling him in one direction, while his desire for freedom pulled him in another. He looked around, taking in the unfamiliar sights and sounds of the city, and for a moment he allowed himself to forget the royal title, the royal duties, and everything that came with being Prince George. But then, in the distance, he saw a group of people walking toward them. They looked like ordinary Londoners, no one special. But as they drew closer, George's heart skipped a beat. One of them turned and caught his eye. It was a photographer snapping pictures of the passing crowd, no doubt looking for a story. "Alexandra, we need to go," George said urgently. "Someone might see us." But it was too late. The photographer had already spotted him, and with the click of the camera, George's heart sank. He was no longer just a teenager enjoying a night out. He was a royal figure, and the world was always watching, even in moments like these. His brief taste of freedom was slipping away faster than he could hold on to it. "Don't worry, George," Alexandra said, trying to remain calm. "It's fine, we'll be fine." But George couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his stomach. The moment he had wanted so badly, freedom, rebellion, breaking away from the royal mold, had turned into something much more complicated, something far more dangerous. As they made their way back to the palace, George's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. He had broken the rules, and there would be consequences. But worse than that, he had allowed himself to be manipulated by Alexandra, someone he thought he could trust. It wasn't just the public's opinion that scared him anymore. It was the realization that his actions, however small, could have far-reaching consequences, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face them. By the time they arrived back at Buckingham Palace, the night felt different. The familiar walls that once seemed comforting now felt like a prison. The weight of the royal title, the expectations, and the fear of the consequences all came crashing down on him. "Next time, think before you act," George whispered to himself, as he quietly entered his room, hoping that no one would find out about his night of rebellion. Little did he know, his actions were about to set off a chain of events that would forever change the course of his life. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Prince George woke up in his room at Buckingham Palace. The events of the night before still lingered in his mind, like an unsettling shadow that refused to fade. He had returned to his room quietly, trying to sneak in unnoticed, but the excitement of the night had been replaced with a deep sense of worry. What if someone had found out? What if the press had captured a photo? Even though he and Alexandra had been careful, the nagging feeling that something might have gone wrong gnawed at him. His usual routine began, but today everything felt different. George found himself going through the motions without truly being present. His morning lesson on royal etiquette seemed trivial compared to the excitement of sneaking around London. But even as he sat at the grand table for breakfast with his family, his mind kept drifting back to the events of the night before. "George, are you feeling all right?" his mother, the Duchess of Cambridge, asked with a concerned glance. She was always perceptive, especially when it came to her children. The look in her eyes made George uncomfortable. She had always known when something was wrong. "I'm fine, Mom," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired from all the training." Catherine gave him a knowing look but didn't press him further. It wasn't unusual for George to feel tired from his rigorous schedule, and she let it go for now. But deep down, George knew his mother had already sensed that something wasn't quite right. And that made him feel even more uneasy. The rest of the day passed in a blur. George attended a series of royal appointments and public events, but his thoughts were far from the royal duties he was expected to perform. His mind kept returning to Alexandra. Why had she pushed him so hard? Why had she encouraged him to defy the royal rules, knowing that the consequences could be severe? It was clear that Alexandra didn't care about the potential fallout. She was more interested in the thrill of breaking the rules, in living outside the boundaries of what was expected. George had always admired her rebellious nature, but now, in the quiet of the palace, he began to realize that her influence on him wasn't as innocent as he had thought. She had taken advantage of his curiosity, his desire for something different, and had used it to push him into making a choice he wasn't ready to face. Later that evening, after a long day of royal engagements, George retreated to his study, hoping to find some peace. He had always enjoyed reading. Books had a way of offering comfort in times of uncertainty. But even as he picked up one of his favorite novels, he couldn't concentrate. The words on the page blurred together, his thoughts constantly interrupted by memories of the night before. His room felt too small, the walls too close. The palace, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a cage. For the first time in his life, George began to question everything he had been taught. Was this really the life he wanted? Was he destined to follow in the footsteps of his ancestors, bound by tradition and duty, with no room to carve out his own path? He couldn't deny the allure of Alexandra's freedom. The way she had lived her life without worrying about the expectations placed on her seemed so liberating. She wasn't afraid to make waves, to do things that others would never dare. She was bold, fearless, and unapologetic about who she was. In many ways, George admired her for that. But as much as he longed for the freedom she represented, he also knew the risks. He had grown up understanding the importance of duty, of tradition. The royal family was a symbol of stability, of honor, and of responsibility. Their actions affected not just their own lives, but the lives of the people who looked up to them. The weight of that responsibility was immense, and George had always known that he would one day have to bear it. But the pressure was starting to get to him. It was hard to keep up the facade of perfection, to always be the model prince, the one who followed the rules and never faltered. There were moments, like last night, when he felt like he just couldn't breathe anymore. He wanted to be his own person, to make his own choices, to live outside the constraints of royal expectations. But could he really do that? Could he live a life of his own while still honoring the legacy of the royal family? As he sat in his study, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He thought about Alexandra and the way she had encouraged him to break free. He wondered if she was right. Maybe it was time to take control of his own life, to stop letting others dictate what he should do. But at the same time, he knew that every decision he made would come with consequences. The royal family was always under scrutiny, and one wrong move could ruin everything. The next day, George had to face his family again. This time, the weight of his actions felt heavier. As he sat down for breakfast, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He felt like he was on the edge of something, but he wasn't sure what. Would he continue down the path of duty, following in the footsteps of his ancestors? Or would he take a different route, one that could lead to freedom, but also to danger? The tension between his duty and his desire for freedom began to eat away at him. He couldn't stop thinking about Alexandra and what she had said. Was she really just a bad influence, or was she showing him a side of life that he had never seen before? As the day unfolded, George found himself once again face to face with the expectations of his royal life. There were public appearances to attend, formal meetings with dignitaries, and endless hours of training. He went through the motions, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was living a life that wasn't entirely his own. He was constantly trying to live up to other people's expectations, to fit into a mold that had been created for him long before he was born. At the same time, there was a part of him that longed for something more. He wanted to make his own decisions, to take risks and live without fear of making mistakes. But could he really throw away everything he had been raised to believe? Could he let go of his duty, his family's legacy, and walk away from everything he had ever known? By the end of the day, George found himself once again in his room, staring out the window at the palace grounds. The cool breeze from outside did little to calm the storm brewing inside him. He felt torn between two worlds, the world of tradition and duty and the world of freedom and rebellion that Alexandra had shown him. But deep down, George knew that the path he chose would not be easy. There was no simple answer, no clear direction. Every choice would have consequences, and he would have to live with them. But for the first time in his life, George wasn't sure if he wanted to be the perfect prince anymore. The weight of the crown was heavy, and he wondered if it was time to let go of the life that had been planned for him. The journey ahead was uncertain, and George didn't know what the future would hold. But one thing was clear: the choice was now in his hands. And whatever path he decided to take, he would have to face it head-on, knowing that it would shape not just his future, but the future of the royal family itself. The days following the eventful night of his secret escape felt like an endless cycle for Prince George. He had returned to his usual routine, but nothing felt quite the same. The royal duties, the public appearances, the endless meetings, it all seemed hollow now. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was living someone else's life. The excitement of sneaking out into London, of breaking away from the watchful eyes of the palace, had left him with an intense yearning for freedom. But freedom came at a price. It was a price George wasn't sure he was willing to pay. As he sat in the royal study one afternoon, surrounded by piles of papers and royal correspondence, George found himself staring out the window. The gardens outside were vast, beautifully manicured and peaceful. But to George, they felt like a metaphor for the life he was expected to lead. Everything was perfect on the outside, orderly and controlled, but underneath, there was a constant pressure to maintain that perfection. George ran his fingers through his hair in frustration. His mind was a whirlwind, full of conflicting thoughts. The royal family expected him to be the model prince, gracious, poised, and always in control. He had spent his entire life following that path, always playing the role assigned to him. But now, after the night in London, he couldn't stop questioning it all. What if there was more to life than just following the rules? What if he could live differently? What if he could be someone else, someone not bound by duty and tradition? But even as these thoughts raced through his mind, George knew the reality of his situation. The royal family was not just a group of people. It was an institution that came with expectations, responsibilities, and obligations. The future of the monarchy was in his hands, whether he liked it or not. And that responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders. The next day, George was once again thrust into the world of royal duties. There were public events to attend, charities to support, and guests to entertain. But as he put on his royal attire and prepared for another formal event, a part of him felt like he was just going through the motions. He wasn't fully there. His thoughts kept drifting back to Alexandra and her words, the way she had convinced him to defy the norms, to step outside the royal bubble. At the time, it had seemed like the perfect escape, the perfect rebellion against the life he had been born into. But now, as he stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his cufflinks, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Was Alexandra's freedom really something to aspire to, or was it just a dangerous path that led nowhere? The more George thought about it, the more uncertain he became. She had shown him a side of life that seemed so thrilling, so full of possibility. But now, with the reality of the consequences settling in, he realized that he wasn't sure if he was ready for that kind of life. As George entered the grand hall where the event was being held, he was greeted by a sea of faces. Dignitaries from all over the world, politicians, and royal family members all gathered for yet another formal gathering. The music played softly in the background, the laughter and chatter of the crowd filled the air, and everything seemed perfect. George smiled and nodded politely as he moved through the crowd, but inside he felt disconnected. The whole event felt like a performance, one he had played countless times before. He was approached by a group of dignitaries who wanted to speak with him about an upcoming charity event. They asked about his thoughts on the cause, the plans for the future, and his involvement. George nodded along, giving the answers he had been trained to give. But his mind wasn't on the conversation. His thoughts were still on the night in London, on the feeling of liberation he had experienced, however brief. The urge to break free, to do something different, to feel alive outside of the palace walls. It was still there, gnawing at him. The conversation continued, but George couldn't focus. His gaze wandered over the crowd, his mind racing. In the distance, he spotted Alexandra, standing near the grand staircase. She was talking to a few other young members of the royal family, laughing and enjoying the attention. She seemed at ease, carefree, the very picture of someone who had nothing to lose. And for a moment, George envied her. He envied her ability to live so freely, to embrace the chaos and the excitement of life without hesitation. But then, something inside him shifted. The image of Alexandra, standing there with a smile on her face, began to feel like a warning. Was that really the kind of life he wanted? A life of unpredictability and rebellion? Would that bring him happiness, or would it only lead to more confusion, more conflict, and more pain? George realized that deep down he didn't want to live like that. He didn't want to be someone who was always chasing the next thrill, always running from the responsibilities that came with his position. But even as he made this realization, George knew that his choice wasn't as simple as just deciding to play the role of the perfect prince again. The truth was, he was caught in a tug-of-war between two versions of himself. The part of him that craved freedom, that longed to break free from the royal expectations, and the part of him that knew the importance of duty, of family, and of tradition. The struggle was exhausting, and George didn't know how to resolve it. Later that evening, as the event wound down and the guests began to leave, George found himself walking alone in the palace gardens. The moonlight bathed the grounds in a soft glow, and for the first time that day, George felt some semblance of peace. He sat down on a bench near the fountain, his hands resting on his lap as he stared at the still water. The world around him seemed so calm, so quiet, but inside his thoughts were loud, chaotic, and overwhelming. He didn't know what to do. The weight of the future pressed down on him, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the choice he had to make wasn't just about himself. It wasn't just about whether he wanted to be free or to live up to the expectations of the royal family. It was about what kind of future he wanted to create, not just for himself, but for the monarchy, for the people who depended on it. George knew that his life would never be simple. He would always be in the spotlight, always expected to act with grace and poise, always held to an impossible standard. But as he sat there, watching the moonlight dance across the water, George began to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a way to find balance between the duty he had to his family and the life he wanted to live. Maybe he could create a path that was uniquely his own, a path that honored both his royal legacy and his desire for something more. But that path, George realized, would not be easy. It would require strength, courage, and sacrifice. And as the cool night air brushed against his skin, George made a quiet promise to himself he would find that balance. He would create his own path, one step at a time. The next morning, George woke up with a new sense of purpose. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that he was ready to face whatever came next. He would face the challenges, the expectations, and the uncertainty with determination. The journey ahead would be difficult, but George was no longer afraid. He had taken the first step toward finding his own way, and that was enough to give him the courage to keep moving forward. The next few days after the royal event were filled with tension for Prince George. It felt as though he were walking on a tightrope, balancing between the expectations of his family and the freedom he longed for. But no matter how hard he tried to keep his mind on his duties, the images of his rebellious night in London kept creeping back into his thoughts. The feeling of escape, the rush of defying the rules, had left a mark on him, and now he couldn't simply ignore it. The royal family had always been a symbol of tradition, stability, and unity, and George had always felt proud to carry that legacy. But after what happened with Alexandra, after he had tasted even a small piece of freedom, the weight of those traditions felt heavier than ever. What was he really living for? Was he meant to continue a life of constant expectation, always controlled, always restrained? Or was there a way to forge his own future, to be the prince he wanted to be, without abandoning his family's legacy entirely? As George sat in his study, staring out at the sprawling gardens, he tried to focus on his royal duties. He had a meeting with his father, Prince William, to discuss future engagements, and the family had been preparing for an upcoming charity gala. But George's mind wasn't on the details of the events. He was stuck, trapped between the two worlds, the world of royal tradition and the world of freedom he had glimpsed. "George!" A voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to find his mother, Catherine, standing in the doorway. Her expression was soft but concerned. "We need to talk." George nodded and stood up, his stomach tightening with anxiety. He knew that the conversation he had been dreading was about to happen. His mother had always been the calm center of the family, and when she spoke, it was impossible to ignore her. He knew she had noticed his change in behavior. He couldn't hide the restlessness inside him any longer. "I think you know why I'm here," Catherine said as she closed the door behind her. She sat down in the chair across from George and looked at him with the kind of understanding that only a mother could have. "You've been distant lately, not just from me, but from the family as a whole." Something's been bothering you, and I think I have a good idea of what it is. George felt a lump form in his throat. He had been hoping to keep his internal struggle a secret, but it seemed his mother had seen right through him. How could he explain the storm inside his head? How could he tell her that, despite all his royal training and upbringing, he felt suffocated by the very life that was meant to protect him? "I'm not sure what you mean, Mom," George said, his voice betraying him with a slight crack. Catherine sighed softly, her gaze never leaving his face. "George, I know that being in the royal family isn't always easy. You carry a lot on your shoulders, and sometimes it must feel like there's no room for you to just be yourself. But that doesn't mean you have to go through this alone." George felt a weight lift off his chest just hearing those words. He had always known that his family cared for him, but there was something comforting about hearing his mother acknowledge how difficult things had been for him. She wasn't judging him. She wasn't angry. She just wanted him to be happy. "I've made some mistakes, Mom," George admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I went against what I was supposed to do. I broke the rules." Catherine reached across the table, placing a gentle hand on his. "George, every person makes mistakes. It's part of growing up. You're not perfect, and that's okay. What matters is what you learn from those mistakes." "But what if I don't know what I'm supposed to learn?" George asked, his voice full of frustration. "What if I don't want to follow the same path everyone else wants me to follow? I just feel stuck." "I know," Catherine said softly. "You're not alone in feeling like that. It's hard, I understand. But sometimes the path you're meant to follow isn't always clear at first. It's okay to question things. But remember, you don't have to make decisions in a hurry. Take your time, and when you're ready, you'll know what to do." George let out a slow breath, absorbing her words. She was right, of course. The pressure to make the right choice, the fear of disappointing everyone, had made him rush through his thoughts without really processing them. Maybe he didn't have to figure it all out today. Maybe he could take his time and find a way to balance what he wanted with what was expected of him. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that. His mother asked about his recent training and what he had been up to, but George could tell she had said everything she needed to say. She had given him the space to think and process, and now it was up to him to decide what came next. Later that evening, George found himself walking alone in the palace gardens. The night was calm, the stars twinkling above him, and the moon casting a soft glow on the paths. He had always found peace in these quiet moments, away from the noise and expectations of royal life. But tonight, even the solitude didn't seem to bring him the comfort it usually did. Instead, it made him feel more isolated than ever. As he walked, his mind wandered back to the night in London. The freedom he had felt, the exhilaration of stepping out of his royal world was still fresh in his memory. But now, in the quiet of the palace grounds, he felt something else: regret. It wasn't the regret of the act itself, but the realization that his choices, however small they seemed, had consequences. He couldn't just throw away his duty, his family, and his legacy. But he also didn't want to live a life where he was never allowed to make his own choices. George knew that he couldn't keep living in two worlds forever. He couldn't keep trying to fit into the mold of the perfect prince while secretly longing for something more. He had to find a way to integrate both sides of himself, the prince who had responsibilities and the young man who wanted to experience life for himself. As the night deepened, George made a decision. He wouldn't let fear dictate his future. He wouldn't let the weight of the crown crush his spirit, but he also wouldn't abandon the royal legacy. He would find a way to create his own path, one that honored both his family and his own desires. The next day, George made his way to the royal library. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew that he needed to learn. He needed to understand how other people had navigated difficult choices and found a balance between their duties and their dreams. He would take the first step toward finding his own way, and he knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. As he walked through the grand halls of the palace, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had been given a chance to shape his own future, and he wasn't going to waste it. Whatever came next, George knew that he was ready. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he would find them, one step at a time. The days after his late-night walk in the gardens seemed to stretch into an endless blur for Prince George. It felt like he had crossed some invisible line that separated the world he knew from the world he had always dreamed of. But the path forward wasn't as clear as he had hoped. He found himself caught in the same push and pull between the life he was born into and the life he wanted to lead. The weight of his royal duties, the expectations of his family, and the role he was meant to play were always looming over him. Yet something inside George had shifted. He was no longer content to simply go through the motions. The idea of living a life dictated entirely by tradition, without the room for personal choice, no longer felt like the right path for him. The taste of freedom he had experienced had made him realize how important it was to be true to himself, to have the space to make his own decisions, even if that meant stepping outside of the boundaries his family had set for him. But he was also aware of the immense responsibility he carried. He couldn't ignore that. He couldn't just walk away from everything he had been taught. It was early one morning when George finally decided to take the first step toward resolving the tension he had been feeling. He had spent the night thinking, turning over every possibility in his mind. He had already spoken with his mother, and her words had given him a sense of clarity. She had told him that it was okay to question things, to take his time in figuring out what he truly wanted. But now George realized that it was time to talk to his father. Prince William, who had always been a figure of strength and guidance for him, would be the one to help him understand how to find that balance. George had always looked up to his father. William had inherited the same sense of duty and responsibility that had been passed down through generations of royals, but he had also carved out his own way of doing things. Prince William had never been one to follow the rules blindly. He had always been thoughtful, deliberate in his actions, and it was this quality in his father that George admired the most. He knew that William would understand the struggle he was going through, and he hoped that their conversation would help him make sense of his feelings. That afternoon, after a long series of royal engagements, George found his father in the royal study, poring over documents. William looked up when he entered the room, offering a warm smile. "George, what's on your mind?" For a moment, George hesitated. He had never been one to openly share his feelings, especially not about something as complicated as this. But this time was different. He knew that he couldn't keep these thoughts to himself any longer. "Dad," George began, taking a seat across from his father. "I've been thinking about everything, about the life we live here and the expectations that come with it. I don't know if I can keep living this way. I don't want to disappoint you or the family, but I feel like I'm not living the life I want to live. I feel trapped." Prince William put down the papers he was holding and gave his son his full attention. There was a quiet understanding in his eyes, a recognition that this was a conversation he had been expecting. He had known for some time that George was struggling with the weight of his future. The royal life was not easy, and George had always been the kind of person to question things, to wonder if there was more to life than the narrow expectations placed upon him. "You're not the first to feel that way," William said softly. "Your grandmother, your great-grandfather, they all had their own moments of doubt. It's natural to feel that way. The royal life comes with immense responsibility, but it also comes with its share of burdens." George listened carefully. His father's words were comforting, but they didn't provide an easy solution. He wasn't asking for permission to abandon his duty. He just wanted to understand how to reconcile his own desires with the duty he had been born into. "I know," George said, nodding slowly, "but sometimes it feels like I'm living someone else's life. I don't know if I can always be the perfect prince, the one everyone expects me to be." Prince William leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "George, there's no such thing as a perfect prince. Perfection is an impossible standard to live up to. The most important thing you can do is be true to yourself. You may be a prince, but you're also an individual. You're allowed to question things, to decide what kind of life you want to lead. But understand that every choice comes with its consequences. You don't have to choose between family and freedom. The key is balance." George felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was as if the weight he had been carrying had suddenly lightened. His father wasn't telling him to blindly follow tradition or to reject everything. He was encouraging him to find his own way, to honor both his family's legacy and his own desires. That was the balance George had been searching for. "I don't know how to find that balance," George admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I don't know where to start." "That's okay," William said with a reassuring smile. "Finding balance doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, and it's okay to take your time. You don't have to have everything figured out right now. The important thing is that you're thinking about it. You're asking the right questions." George thought about his father's words as they sat in silence for a moment. The tension in his chest had eased, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a direction. He didn't have all the answers, but he was starting to understand what he needed to do. Later that evening, as he walked through the palace corridors, George reflected on everything he had learned. He still felt uncertain about what the future would hold, but he knew that he was no longer afraid of it. The royal life was a difficult one, but it was also one that came with great purpose. He had a responsibility, not just to his family, but to the people who looked to the monarchy for guidance. But even within that responsibility, there was room for his own voice, his own choices. George didn't have to live a life of complete rebellion, nor did he have to conform to every expectation placed upon him. There was space for him to be both a prince and an individual. As the days passed, George began to take small steps toward this new understanding. He started to speak up more, to share his ideas with his family and advisors, even when those ideas didn't always align with tradition. He sought out opportunities to make decisions for himself, to take on more responsibility in ways that felt authentic to him. And with each decision, George grew more confident in his ability to balance his duties with his personal desires. In time, George realized that his journey wasn't about choosing one path over the other. It wasn't about rejecting his royal heritage or running from his responsibilities. It was about learning how to navigate both worlds, finding a way to live as a prince, with all the expectations that came with it, while also making space for his own dreams and aspirations. He had come to understand that true strength didn't come from perfection or adherence to tradition. True strength came from the courage to be yourself, to face the challenges that came with your choices, and to move forward with confidence, even when the path ahead wasn't always clear. And so George continued to walk that path, one step at a time, knowing that he was no longer trapped by his role as a prince, but rather empowered by the freedom to choose who he wanted to be.